and welcome back to another installment of the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. I am your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and before we begin tonight's session, I have some wonderful news to share with you, and that is that earlier today, our oldest daughter, Ayala, became engaged to Dovi Garfinkel of Chicago, Illinois. We are very excited, we are very thrilled, and I just wanted to start off by sharing the wonderful, wonderful news with all of you here tonight. Mazel Tov. We should only share together in Simchas. If you're with us here in Cleveland or in Chicago, stay tuned for details on an engagement party, and the wedding details will follow after that. So Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov. Okay. Tonight, we will deep dive into the discussion of the rise of Islam. Now, it's important for us to realize the backdrop of the relationship between the people that Islam grew out of and the Jewish people before the rise of Islam. So traditionally, we look at the religion of Islam as growing out of the descendants of Ishmael. By the way, that's not so that's not so proven. We're not so 100% sure about that, but that's at least the claim that is often made. So if we assume that to be true, we have to understand that even though Isaac and Ishmael, Yitzchak and Ishmael had strife through most of their life, in the end they reconciled. And we know this is pointed out to us because when Abraham passes away, we see that Ishmael allows Yitzchak to walk in front of him, showing that even though I'm technically the oldest, he's the one who is going to be the main brother now, the main descendant now. He's going to carry the torch, and I defer to him. And we essentially see from that point on in history that the Jews and the Ishmaelites basically get along. Okay, there were some hiccups along the way. There was a hiccup after the destruction of the first temple, but for the most part, they get along. And we see that even within Judaism, there's a certain amount of respect for Ishmael as a cousin, because we will meet many, many people from the days of Ishmael until the rise of Islam who have the name Ishmael. At the time of Tzom Gedalia, the descendant of King David who perpetrated that horrendous act, but was a descendant of King David, his name was Yishmael ben Netanyahu. I always say there is something to say on that name, I just haven't figured it out. In the Mishnah, we have the famous Rebbe Yishmael, and we even mention one of his Mishnaic and one of his Tanaic statements in the morning davening. And so there are many, those are just two famous examples, but there's many Yishmaels mentioned throughout Judaism from the time of the original Yishmael until the rise of Islam. So we could deduce from that if Yishmael was an enemy to the Jewish people, then no Jewish mother in her right mind would name her kid after Yishmael. So it must be that he was considered a respectable character from that perspective. And my theory is that lasts up until the 7th century, up until the rise of Islam, and then everything changes. Okay, so what happens with the rise of Islam? Where does it come from? So, center stage in the rise of Islam is modern day Saudi Arabia. It is not called Saudi Arabia at that point. It's just called Arabia or the Arab country. It won't be called Saudi Arabia until much later when Ibn Saud will conquer it in more modern times, 19th century, and make the Saud dynasty that is controlling there now. But it's Arabia. It's called Arabia at that point. And this is a part of the former Babylonian Empire that was never conquered by the Christians, so Christianity never takes hold here. So essentially everyone in this area is still a pagan. And we focus in on a man by the name of Muhammad. Now, Muhammad was born in the year 570, and he was born to a family known as the Hashemites. Now, we know the name Hashemite because the modern-day rulers of the Kingdom of Jordan are descendants of the Hashemites. Now, in truth, the Hashemites were a leading force in the Islamic world for many, 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 many centuries, really up until modern times, up until the British Mandate. And they controlled, not only did they control Jordan, but they controlled Syria, and they controlled many parts, they controlled Mecca, Medina, they controlled many, many parts of the Arab world. Now they're just left with Jordan. So the Hashemites, a lot of their claim to fame now is that they say that they are the tribe that Muhammad came from. Okay. So Muhammad was an orphan from his father before he was born and from his mother at the age of 6. So he was raised by Bedouins and he became a caravan leader. Now, caravan leaders were a very prosperous job back then. It was a dangerous job and people paid a lot of money for it. And it was considered a very worthy way to make a living. Now, as a caravan driver, you would often interact with many different types of people. So through these interactions, Muhammad started to become exposed to ideas of monotheism, both through Jewish passengers on his caravan and Jews that he would interact with in cities that he would go to, with Christian people in his caravan and Christians in cities that he would go to. And as we said with the rise of Christianity, that the rise of Christianity came into a pagan world that saw paganism as bankrupt. And that was essentially the same attitude in the Arab world at this point. Yes, they were still technically pagans, but they saw paganism as bankrupt. So Muhammad became very intrigued by these ideas of monotheism. Now, one of the early turning points in Muhammad's life is that he marries a very, very wealthy widow by the name of Khadija. Now, Khadija was many, many years his senior. She was over 20 years older than him. And, as my grandfather would always say, you can marry more money in a moment than you can make in a lifetime. And that's essentially what Muhammad did, so that the money that Khadija brought to the soon-to-be empire was what really supports him. Now, she will die in 1619, and we understand that the time period of his life that he's married to Khadija is a very normal time period of his life. The next 13 years after she passes away are extremely tumultuous. In fact, the whole idea of polygamy within Islam does not arise until after Khadija passes away. He is only married to Khadija the whole time. After Khadija passes away, which is when the religion really gets going, he will end up marrying many, many, many wives. He will have many, many, many concubines, and that'll be enough to kill anybody. So that's what happens during his life. Now, what's interesting is that Muhammad and Khadija have a daughter by the name of Fatima. And Fatima is going to play her own special role in Islam. And out of all of Muhammad's children, she's going to be the crown jewel in many ways. And we're going to see how that'll play out after Muhammad passes away. So we have Khadija, his first wife. We have Fatima, his first daughter. And they are central figures in the rise of Islam. Okay, so where does this all start? In the year 610, Muhammad, who had already been inspired by these ideas of monotheism and was already growing closer and closer to spirituality, as Muslim tradition teaches it, he was one day praying in the Hira cave, and while he was praying in the Hira cave, the angel Gabriel came to him. We call him Gabriel, but they call him the angel Gabriel. And the angel Gabriel tells Muhammad that the Arabs must stop worshiping paganism, they should only believe in one God, and he was going to be the one to bring this idea of monotheism to the Arab world. Now, as it is written, the vision of the angel Gabriel initially scares Muhammad tremendously because, let's face it, walking around in Arabia in those days, there was the summer heat, the summer sun was hot, there was a lot of hashish to be smoked, and a lot of people had visions. So it wasn't so abnormal to be a visionary. And usually if you came and said you had a vision, people say, no, you got a vision. Big deal. You smoked a little too much hashish. So he was frightened because he didn't want to be labeled as one of these crazy men. But it was his wife, Khadija, who gave him the initial support, encouraged him to go public with his message. And he starts that year, in the year 610, teaching the ideas of monotheism to the masses as much as he can within the area of Arabia. Now, the problem that he has is, as he starts in 610 and starts to move on, he starts to develop his different philosophies, and he starts to speak out against paganism, and he starts to speak about one God, and he starts to bring it all together, and he incorporates a lot of the Arabic culture. This ended up being very threatening to the business in his hometown of Mecca. Now, why was that? Because Mecca had a famous pagan shrine by the name of the Kaaba. Now, it would seem the actual origins of the Kaaba, no one really knows. Islam has their own theory, which we'll get to in a moment. But it was some sort of pagan shrine, a big box that had been destroyed and rebuilt a number of times. And inside this big box, there were all kinds of idols to all different pagan gods throughout the world. And the Kaaba was a tremendous pilgrimage site. We see that eventually Muhammad just incorporates that into Islam. We'll see how he does that in a minute. But if Muhammad is speaking out against polytheism, speaking out against paganism, and he's starting to get a traction within Mecca, well, that is challenging the wealthy establishment in Mecca. And, he starts to be shut up. They want him to be quiet. They don't want him gaining so many followers. Okay. In the year 620, so this is 10 years after his first vision in the cave, he has what is referred to in Islam as the Isra and the Miraj. Now, the Isra this is collectively called his night journey. And Isra, he claims, Isra in Arabic means beginning, and he claims to have gone with the angel Gabriel on a winged horse that he called Al-Barak. The president was eventually named after this horse. And the horse had the body of a horse, the face of a woman, and the tail of a peacock. And they went to Al-Aqsa. Now, Al-Aqsa in Arabic means distant place. Okay? That's what it means. It means distant place. In other words, just so we're very clear, it does not mean Jerusalem. We'll get to that in a moment, how Al-Aqsa eventually becomes associated with Jerusalem. But in the Quran, which we'll talk about what that is in a moment, the Quran, it only refers to Muhammad going with the angel Gabriel on Al-Barak to Al-Aqsa and never tells us where Al-Aqsa is. In fact, the word Jerusalem is never even mentioned in the Quran. Right? There's no mentioning in the Quran of Muhammad ever going to Jerusalem, ever having an interest in Jerusalem. Not there at all. Okay. So the first part of this night of fantasies is they go from Mecca to Al-Aqsa, which just means the distant place, the furthest, most holiest spot in Arabic. And there he leads all the great prophets of world history in prayer. Then he has Miraj, which means ascent, where he is given a tour of heaven, and he speaks to Avraham, to Moshe, to Yashka, and eventually to Allah, which is the Arabic word for God, for one God. And it is at that time he is given the pillar, which is one of the main pillars of Islam, of prayer. Okay, that happens in 620. So after this happens, he's ready to go. Now his wife is gone at this point. His wife passed away the year before, but he is charged up, he's fired up, he is ready to really spread this religion to the world. And as he starts to have more and more success, just 2 years later, in 622, he is kicked out of Mecca by the wealthy businessmen there who don't want him challenging their hold on the Kaaba and the pilgrimage money that they get when people come to visit the Kaaba. So in 622, Muhammad and his followers are forced to leave Mecca, and they go to the city of Yatib. Yatib is about 280 miles away from Mecca, still in modern-day Saudi Arabia, and still was just called Arabia at that time. And they ended up naming that town. They changed the name of it from Yatib to Medinat Nabi, which means the city or the state of the prophet, or for short, they call it Medina or Medina. Okay, so this is how Medina becomes a holy city in Islam, because in 622 is when Muhammad and his followers have to flee Mecca. They go to what becomes known as Medina, and we'll see what happens when they get there. What's interesting is the city of Medina at that time had a very large Jewish population, and many believe it was during this time when Muhammad took on a strong Jewish influence. We're going to see that similar to what Christianity does when it becomes popular and takes over the Roman Empire, Islam also makes an effort to incorporate all the other world religions within its philosophies, within its laws, and we see that a lot of that happens at this time when Muhammad is interacting with the Jews of Medina. And in fact, at this point, the early Muslims are praying towards towards Jerusalem. They take on the idea of not eating pork, of only eating halal, which means meat without pork. They take on the idea of having to be circumcised. All this comes about, halal is their slaughter. They don't eat pork, and they don't, they get circumcised, and all of that comes about seemingly at this point. Now, Muhammad does this similar to how the Romans did it, and similar to how Martin Luther will be another person who will do this. He expects that when he does this, the Jews will join up with him. But they reject him. They're not interested in this religion. So we see that Muhammad will go through a transition in his life. That at this point, he seems to be a Philo-Semite. He seems to like the Jewish people. When he adds the Jewish ideas into his religion and the Jews don't ultimately accept his religion, we see that he goes very cold, and even to the point where at the end of his life, he is pretty anti-Semitic. And the Quran goes sequential like that. The Quran, which tells the story of his life, goes sequential. So yes, there are parts of the Quran that are very Philo-Semitic. There's parts that are very parv to the Jews, and there are parts that are very anti-Semitic. So you can really pick and choose whatever you want out of the Quran as far as what Islam says about the Jews, which is one of our problems today, that radical Islam definitely looks at the end of the book, which arguably is the more authoritative part of the book, because in the different parts of the Quran build on each other. But there are definitely more moderate Muslims who try to look more towards the middle and the beginning of the book, and therefore, Baruch Hashem, we do have some Muslim groups that we have a good relationship with. Okay, while Muhammad is in Medina, that's where he really starts to gain a tremendous strength. He gains a ton of followers in Medina, and in that city, he destroys all of his enemies. He takes over that city, and just 2 years later, in 624, he goes back to Mecca, fights many wars along the way, and with his army, he walks triumphantly into Mecca. He takes over the city almost without bloodshed, and at this point, he's got the city of Mecca, he's got the city of Medina, and we'll see over the next 8 years, he only has 8 years left of his life, he will successfully unite the whole entire Arab people under his religion, which is fascinating if you think about it. His first vision is in the year 610. Okay? The Hiraj is in the year 620. Now that's Muslim, that's year 1 in Islam. Right? We're in the year, well, I'll have it later here in my notes. We're in the year, I think, 1441 according to the Muslims, but year 1 is 620. And by 632, when he passes away, all of the Arab world has been conquered and is following this new religion of Islam that only started 22 years before. Crazy fast spread of the religion. Now, when Muhammad returns to Mecca and is successful there, he has a vision, again, Angel Gabriel, and he's told that they weren't making enough headway. It wasn't enough to have discussions with people and offer them conversion to Islam. They had to force people to convert to Islam. And thus begins the idea of jihad, which means to essentially go on a holy war, and the idea of forcible conversion. Now, even though at this point in the Christian world, as we've discussed, there was already plenty of anti-Semitism, plenty of hatred towards the Jews, all that existed, plenty of persecution, the idea of forced conversion didn't exist yet. Forced conversion is created by this vision of Muhammad, and we're going to see that right after he perpetuates this throughout the world, the Christians will grab onto it and run with it in the form of the Crusades and everything that comes through the Dark Ages. So that's where the whole idea of jihad, of the holy war, forced conversion, that's where it comes from. Now, at this point, when Muhammad takes over Mecca and it becomes the main center of Islam in the world, he also takes over the Kaaba, the big black box building that we mentioned before. That was a pagan shrine, and he destroys all of the symbols of idols that are inside, except for some sort of symbol of Jesus, Mary, and Ibrahim. Now, Ibrahim is how you say Abraham in Arabic. Now, according to Muslim tradition, the Kaaba was always connected to Ishmael, to Yishmael, and that shortly after Abraham sends Hagar away and Ishmael away, he goes to Mecca and he builds the Kaaba together with Ishmael. So according to Muslim tradition, the Kaaba is built by Abraham and Yishmael. And also according to Muslim tradition, both Yishmael and Hagar are buried right outside of the Kaaba. So that's really how they take this pagan shrine and they rope it into everything that they see as their religion. And that becomes a holy spot in Islam, to the point where today that Muslim has to sometime in his life try to go on a pilgrimage to go to both Mecca and Medina. They walk around the Kaaba 7 times, and it's wonderful. It's similar to in Muhammad's time. It's a wonderful source of income for the Saudis now, but that's basically what the Kaaba is. He incorporates this pagan shrine into his religion and makes it the central place. So we already mentioned how he did many things to try and adopt or embrace Judaism. He does the same thing with Christianity. And that's why in the Bible, which, like we said, his Bible, the Quran, which is the running commentary of his life, there are many quotes in there that sound very similar to what's in the Torah, many quotes in there that sound very similar to what's in the Christian Bible, and then ultimately the life of Muhammad. Because he tries to incorporate it all, because their goal was to conquer the whole entire world. That is what is clear by the year 632 when Muhammad passes away. Now, the question is, what happens after Muhammad passes away? So, first of all, the Quran, the belief is the story of Muhammad's life and the philosophies of Islam. The belief is that it was orally revealed by God to Muhammad through Gabriel, through the angel Gabriel, and that this is one of the signs of the prophecy, the great prophecy of Muhammad, because here he was illiterate and he was able to transcribe this book, and that's where they say that it came from. Now, the month where that happened was the month of Ramadan, and that's why Ramadan is a holy month within Islam. And that happened that started when Muhammad was 40 and then concluded when he died in the year 32. And that becomes the fundamental book of Islam, and we'll see by the successors of Muhammad will do their part through their conquests and distributing the Quran all over the areas that they distribute, that they conquer. Now, Muhammad, it seems that the main philosophy of Muhammad is that the leadership of Islam was supposed to be democratic. In other words, that the successors, known as the caliphs, were to be elected by a council, and so it was. The main belief was that it was to be a meritocracy. But like in any religion, especially religion that's only 30 years old or 20 years old at the time when the succession leadership is necessary, we're going to see that the succession is not so simple. But before we get into that, the idea of conquest that Muhammad puts into place carries on long after he passed away. The time period of the early Muslim conquest goes from the end of Muhammad's life, 632, for the next 120 years until at least the year 750, according to most historians. Now, the main event that really turns the tide of the Muslim conquest will be the Battle of Tours, where Charles Martel in 732 stops the Muslims from invading France. They had already invaded Northern Africa. They'd already invaded Spain. And if Charles Martel had not been successful in the Battle of Tours, it could have been the Muslims would have conquered the whole entire world. And instead of speaking English right now, we would be speaking Arabic. But that really is the end of the Muslim conquest, and sort of like the lines of scrimmage in many ways are drawn, which become the lines of scrimmage in many ways until today, as we'll discuss in the coming sessions. Now, what happens with the leadership after Muhammad dies? So after Muhammad dies, the vote is taken, and one of his disciples by the name of Abu Bakr is elected as the second caliph, or the first caliph after Muhammad. Okay, he rules for a period of time, and then there is a caliph, Omar. And after Omar, he'll rule for a period of time. And then there is Uthman ibn al-Affan, who is going to be killed in a war. And then we will get to somebody by the name of Ali, and we'll see how he fits into all this. Okay, so Abu Bakr really he puts a lot of the ideas of Muhammad into place, unifying Arabia, starting to circulate the Quran. Now, Omar is the one who really, the second caliph after Muhammad, is the one who really, under his rule, is when Islam expands rapidly. We see that the Muslims will conquer scores of the former Persian Empire, scores of the former Byzantine Empire, and that will be the really tremendous rapid spread of Islam throughout the world. Now, in the year 6 637, Omar is the first leader of Islam to ever come to Jerusalem. He conquers Jerusalem. Now, when he gets to Jerusalem, he asked an apostate Jew who is part of his army, so a Jew who had converted to Islam, who was part of his army, where he should pray while he is in Jerusalem. And the apostate Jew says, well, the holiest spot is what's known. The Romans called it Aelia Capitolina. The Jews called it the Temple Mount. It's where Solomon built a temple. The Christians, again, there's conflicting stories. Maybe they put something there. Maybe they didn't put something there. It's unclear. But basically, this apostate Jew says, go to the Temple Mount because that is the place where the Jews had a temple. So think about it for a minute. The whole reason that Jerusalem becomes a holy spot in Islam is because the Caliph Omar goes there to pray because that's where the Jews had a temple. So it's fascinating how nowadays there's so much effort put into on the part of the Arabs today, the Arabs in Israel, to try and de-Judaize the Temple Mount, say there's never a temple there, get rid of all the artifacts, where the whole reason it's holy to their religion is the fact that there was a temple there. So in fact, Omar prays there, and he's the one who decides, 5 years after Muhammad passes away, that this is the aforementioned Al-Aqsa from the Quran. He probably begins the building of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Dome of the Rock, it's unclear if he started the building of it or if it was there already as a Byzantine structure, maybe even a Christian structure. According to many opinions, based on the architecture and the artwork inside, which don't really match up with a lot of other Muslim architecture, it was probably there before Omar ever got there. But be it as it may, he decided that was the spot, that the rock inside was where Muhammad ascended to heaven to have his meeting with all the prophets. And again, the whole reason he got there in the first place, the whole reason Omar got there in the first place, and the whole reason why the angel Gabriel brought Muhammad to that place was because that's where the Jews had a temple. So again, it's just to reiterate, it's almost comical that the Muslims of today try to de-Judaize the Temple Mount, where the whole reason that it starts off as holy in Islam is because the temple was there. Now, by the way, there are many of the Jewish holy sites in Israel have significance in Islam too, because they're looked at as the family of Muhammad. For example, did you ever wonder why the Cave of the Patriarchs is holy in Islam? I just told you, according to their tradition, Ishmael and Hagar are buried in Mecca. In Mecca. So why is the place where Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov Adam, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and then Sarah, Rivka, Leah, and of course Eve, why is the place where these four couples are buried holy in Islam? And the answer is because they are the family of Ishmael, the earliest member of their nation. And that's also why the tomb of Rachel in Bethlehem has a significance within Islam, because Rachel was also a cousin of Yishmael. So they do, in many ways, even today, undeniably incorporate Jewish holy sites, or try to incorporate Jewish holy sites into their religion. But when it comes to the Temple Mount, no, that's just Al-Aqsa, no connection to the temple, nothing, even though that's where it all started. Okay, so also, it's interesting to point out that even though Omar makes it Al-Aqsa, the distant place, makes it a holy spot, even makes it the third holiest city in Islam after Mecca and Medina, never, ever, ever in the course of from this point of 637 until 2022 is there any Muslim kingdom that makes Jerusalem a capital. Even though it's the third holiest city in Islam, we're going to see that for the overwhelming majority of all these years, the way that it is treated, even when it's under Muslim control, is that it's a backwater, rundown, insignificant part of the empires. And the only ones besides the Jews, good trivia question, the only ones besides the Jews ever to have a capital in Jerusalem are the Crusaders, who have a capital there for 100 years, but the Muslims never, ever have a capital there. Okay, so that's what Omar does. Now, what happens after Omar passes away is the third leader of Islam after Muhammad is Uthman, who was elected in 644, and he doesn't seem to have a significant role in conquest, but we see that under his leadership there is the outbreak of a civil war within Islam. So it's just, again, fascinating to look at that from 610 to 632, they have their prophet. From 632 to roughly 56, I believe it is, they are basically united and do a lot of conquests. But in 656, they have their first civil war about how to essentially, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely, who should be in charge of Islam. And here's what the debate is. The debate is, should the leader, the caliph of Islam be as we described? It should be someone, a meritocracy, someone elected democratically, or should it be somebody by the name of Ali? Now, who was Ali? Ali was a cousin of Muhammad, and he was the husband of Fatima, of Muhammad's prized daughter. And the belief of Ali and his camp was that the mantle of leadership of Islam should always stay in the hands of Muhammad's family. And that is represented by Ali. By the way, he should not be confused with Muhammad Ali, but this is what Ali represents, or Prince Ali from Aladdin, all just borrowing his name, named after him. Now, Ali himself is assassinated in 661, and to avoid further fighting, his son, Hassan ibn Ali, signs a peace treaty with everybody else. He abdicates the leadership to Muawiyah, who becomes the new caliph, and that begins the Umayyad dynasty, which is going to be one of the big Muslim dynasties. Now, this doesn't really end the dispute between those who feel that Islam should be led by the family of Muhammad or those who feel that it should be a meritocracy. And this essentially gives the beginning to the terms that we're all familiar with nowadays, the Sunni and the Shiite schism. So what exactly is the schism over here? The schism over here is that the Sunnis, now the word Sunni in Islam means the behavior of the Prophet, the behavior of Muhammad, because they claim to follow in the spirit of Muhammad. And the Sunnis are the ones that believe it's a meritocracy. They believe that it was this path that went from Abu Bakr to Omar and so forth, elected leaders, that was the right way. And in general, the Sunnis are developed a slightly more relaxed version of Islam. They have some sort of an oral tradition. And 85% of today's Muslim world is Sunni Muslim. Now, that's 85%, you can do your math, 85% of 1.8 billion. That today, roughly 25% of the world is Islam, and of that 1.8 billion, 85% is Sunni. So most Muslim countries in the world are Sunni countries, and they have a reputation of being slightly more moderate than their Shiite cousins. Now, there are some other subdivisions within Sunni and within Shia, but there's maybe altogether 10, 20, maybe 30 divisions. But be it as it may, the big one, the main one is Sunni, the ones who claim to go in the spirit of Muhammad and who think that the successor leadership can be elected and to have a slightly more relaxed approach to Islamic law. The ones who believe that the leader has to be from the family of Muhammad is the Shia Muslims. Shia is a shortened version of Shiatu Ali, which means followers of Ali, because they followed Ali, and they take Islam much more literally. They take the words of the Quran much more literally. They have a concept of an imam as the leader, and the imams, again, all are descendants from that Hashemite family, from the family of Muhammad in one way, shape, or form. And if you ever heard of Shia law, which is much more strict than the Sunni approach, that also comes from the Shia Muslims. Now, the Shias only make up about 15% of the Muslim world today, and where we find them now, again, 15% of 1.8 billion is still a lot of people. So the Shiite Muslims are about 15% of the 1.8 billion Muslims in the world today. Now, where we find them is that 40% of the world's Shiite Muslims, so that's about 70 million, are found within Iran. Now, that makes up roughly 90% of the Iranian Muslim community. Okay, so definitely, as you always probably understood before this class tonight, that Shia and Iran are associated together, and that's because that is the largest population of Shia Muslims in the world, and the country is almost entirely Shia Muslims. The number 2 location for Shia Muslims is Pakistan. There's about 25 million there. That makes up 15% of the Shia Muslims in the world and 15% of the population of Pakistan, which is almost completely a Muslim country. Iraq has about 20 million Shia Muslims, which is roughly 10% of the Shiite world and roughly 60% of Iraq's Muslims. That led to a lot of the civil wars during the time of Saddam Hussein, who would persecute the Shiite Muslims, or the Sunni Muslims. I forget which one would persecute which, but they were split roughly 60-40, with the Shias being a slight majority. And the last country with a major Shiite population is India, with 15 million, which is 10% of the Muslims in India, and roughly 10% of the Shiite Muslims in the world. Now, in America, there are about 250,000 Shiite Muslims, basically all in Dearborn, Michigan, and that's out of about 4 million Muslims in America today. Okay, so that's where you find the Shiites. Virtually any other Muslim part of the world, Northern Africa, the Middle East, the rest of Pakistan, all these other places where Islam, Bangladesh, etc., 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 they are all going to be the Sunni Muslims, making up 24% of the world, or 1.8 billion people. Now, I mentioned before that I would give you the exact date today on the Muslim calendar. The exact date today on the Muslim calendar is Jumada al-Thani 15 in the year 1443, because they're counting from that Hijrah of Muhammad. So that's the Muslim year we're in right now. Now, one thing that you're probably familiar with about Islam is that they are a lunar calendar strictly. Unlike us, we have a Sunni lunar calendar, which means that we're a lunar calendar that adjusts for the seasons. They don't adjust for the seasons. So like Ramadan, for example, their holy month where they fast all day and party all night, it's going to be 11 days earlier on the solar calendar every year. So, you do your math that over the course of, whatever it is, 40, or 40 years, it goes through a whole cycle of the whole year. So sometimes you have Ramadan in the middle of summer where their days are very long, and sometimes you have it in the middle of the winter and every other season as well. Okay, now it's interesting to point out that we nowadays have a vision of Islam that we'll get to in later sessions, and the Muslim world is sort of being backwards and maybe a little archaic and a little primitive compared to the Christian world and the Jewish world. But what's interesting is during this time period, from the 7th century through the Dark Ages, until we get to the Renaissance, the Muslims are really going to be the source of culture of the world. Because while the Christian world is going to dive deep into the Dark Ages and have almost no culture whatsoever, the Muslim world is going to have a tremendous amount of culture. Again, things probably flipped a little bit around, after whatever. Well, we'll talk about those those times as they come, but 19th century, 20th century. But we have a lot to be thankful for the Arabs. First of all, Arabic numerals. Before they had to do math with the Roman numerals, and you can imagine how hard that was. It's much easier with Arabic numerals as we have today. Algebra, the concept of zero, that all comes from the Muslims. And there's also a great influence of the Muslims on the Jews. We're going to see that the idea of philosophy becoming a vocation within the Jewish people is going to be because of Muslim influence. Now, that's not to say that the Talmud's not full of philosophic ideas, but the idea of philosophic writings, a focus on philosophy, that'll come in wake of a Muslim influence on the Jewish people. And a lot of the great halachic works will be in response to Jews living in the Muslim world. Poetry in the Jewish people. Poetry is a big thing. If you ever were at synagogue on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, half the service is medieval poetry written by Jews who were influenced by Muslims who were very into poetry. So they had a tremendous effect on the Jewish people during the Dark Ages, for the Jews that lived in the Muslim countries. And for the most part, Jews got along. Jews came to a accommodation with the Muslims. It's interesting, again, because we think in modern terms and you say, who do we have bigger issues with? And everyone would say, in modern days, it's the Muslims, it's the radical Islam, it's the terrorism, it's what goes on in Israel, 9/11, etc., etc. But that's modern days, where really those sects of radical Islam have really just imported ancient Christian anti-Semitism, which the Christians, thank God, have thrown out, and that's what they're doing. But up until modern times, Jews always fared much better in Muslim countries than in Christian countries. And again, we're going to see there's some exceptions. There's definitely some persecution of Jews at the hands of Muslims, but overwhelmingly, we're going to do much better with Muslims than we do with Christians. And the reason for that is because we come to this combination of what's called a demi. A demi Dhimmi in Arabic means a person of the book. So it basically means a monotheist who didn't accept Islam, but at least believes in one God. And now dhimmis are often not treated very nicely, but they were allowed to have synagogues or churches. They were allowed to practice their religion. Now pagans had no choice. Pagans had to convert to Islam or be killed. The dhimmis, though, they could still practice their religion. They had to pay taxes. They had to often wear yellow stars. That's the idea of the yellow star. If there's a Muslim walking on one side of the street, the dhimmi had to walk on the other side of the street. The shuls were built subterranean. So that's why if you ever wondered, when you go like in many places in Israel, especially in the old city of Jerusalem, which in the time when a lot of those synagogues were built, it was under Muslim control. The Ramban synagogue is a famous example. It's subterranean because that was the only way they were allowed to build a synagogue. Now, we'll talk about this more when we get to modern times, but it's important to point out as a philosophy where a lot of the issues that we have today come between really the Western world and Islam, but for sure the Jews and Islam. That is, that there's a philosophy in Islam called Dar al-Islam, which means the house of Islam, and Dar al-Kharib, which means the house of the sword. And essentially that's two divisions of the world. Either the world that's accepted Islam or the world of the sword. Now, what do you think it means to be the world of the sword? It means the people who we are going to still wage holy wars against to be able to conquer them, to bring them onto Dar al-Islam. So what we see, really the transition of Muslims incorporating their issues with the West, their issues with the Jews, it comes once that Dar al-Islam starts to fall apart with the crumbling of the Ottoman Empire after World War I, really leading up to World War I, but after World War I. And we're going to see a lot of Muslim countries end up in non-Muslim hands. Most notably will be Israel, right? Because Israel was a part of the Ottoman Empire. And in Muslim philosophy, you cannot have an area that was Dar al-Islam, that had already accepted Islam, that goes back to being Dar al-Kharib. So that is, at least at its philosophical core, where a lot of the issues between our Arab cousins and ourselves come from. But again, we'll talk about that in several sessions when we get to the modern era. But this has been an introduction to Islam. I hope you've found it fascinating, and hit me up with any questions that you have. And I want to thank you all for coming, and thank you for listening.